friends, this concluding session, I would like to reflect a bit with you on the past and the future. First, on our past. We have been celebrating here the 10th anniversary of the World Public Forum, and indeed we have reason to celebrate and be proud. We have accomplished much. We have advanced from a relatively small, little-known organization into a large and globally recognized forum where major issues of the world are being discussed in a spirit of cooperation. And much of this success is due to the tireless work of a number of people. First and foremost, our founding president, Jaak Koonin, who is presently suffering from a very bad cold and needs all our good wishes. Of course, there is also his executive team, the International Coordinating Committee, but I think most of the credit goes to you, to the members, to the participants of the forum. So I congratulate you for your tireless efforts to make this forum happen. So we have 10 years of learning, of experimenting, of dialoguing. But I want to suggest to you that the spirit of our endeavor is much older than 10 years. It is indeed the animating spirit, the inspiration, the longing of humankind throughout the centuries. We are also inspired, and we are grateful to President Khatami for his inspiration. In a short essay which I wrote on Who Are We, and which you can find in the book which was given to you this year, I refer to an organization that existed almost 100 years ago, between the two world wars. It was called the World Committee Against War and Fascism. If we mean by fascism, as I do, an aggressive military unilateralism, that means an aggressive monologue, then we stand for and against the same thing as that committee, namely against militarism in any form, against aggressive war, and for multilateral cooperation and peace. Now, the committee at that time included such famous intellectuals and writers like Maxim Gorky, Bertrand Russell, Albert Einstein, John Dos Passos, and Romain Rolland. Now this, I believe, is the tradition really in which we stand, at least 100 years old. Of course, there are other traditions also which we can claim, the tradition of the Mahatma Gandhi, and all the traditions, the tradition of the Erasmus, the tradition of Cusanus, the tradition of Francis of Assisi. And as you know, I have placed the forum under the patronage of Francis of Assisi. Now you know. Now, but of course, I don't want to just go back. I want to look with you now to take a look at the present and the future. I do not have to tell you, we live in an extremely turbulent and dangerous time where the world is threatened by multiple dangers. A major war, possibly a nuclear winter, financial chaos, environmental disaster. What we need at this time is courage, strength to carry out our work. Now, in our opening session, the first session was opened by a statement by one of the most courageous intellectuals in the world today, namely Noam Chomsky. That was the opening statement. Now, I like at the end always to go back to the beginning and to tie together beginning and ending. Now, Noam Chomsky just recently published a book which is called Making the Future: Occupations, Interventions, Empire, and Resistance. That's the title of his book. Now, I have written some reflections on this book, and I want to share some of them with you. In this book, Chomsky repeatedly uses the phrase, the owners of the world. The owners of the world. Now, this phrase means, of course, that some people possess the world, while others are possessed or dispossessed. Now, in order to highlight the meaning of this phrase, owners of the world, I start in a totally different registers. The famous German poet Goethe wrote a very famous cycle of poems, which is called the West-Eastern Divan, which is actually a dialogue between Goethe and the great Persian poet Hafiz. So we have a dialogical tradition here. Now this poem starts, Goethe's poem starts with these words. To God belongs the Orient, to God belongs the Occident, northerly and southern lands peacefully rest in his hands. Now, I tell you, the German actually sounds much better. It is, Gottes ist der Orient, Gottes ist der Occident, Nord- und südliches Gelände ruhen im Frieden seiner Hände. Now, these lines very clearly announce a very peculiar kind of ownership or belonging. The entire world we are given to understand belongs to God, or in a sense is divine or sacred at its core. However, belonging or ownership here does not denote a proprietary possession, because it does not exclude, it does not disown, it does not expropriate anybody or anything. On the contrary, by virtue of an enormous generosity, an enormous largesse, all beings, human beings and other beings, are first of all empowered, enabled, endowed to share in the ownership as recipients of a gift. Now, these Goethe's lines came to my mind when reading the essays assembled in Noam Chomsky's recent book. One of the opening essays is titled, as I said, We Own the World. Now, commenting on the usual debate between hawks and doves in American foreign policy, Chomsky points to an underlying premise, which he says is accepted on all sides. And I quote him, "The entire debate can proceed without absurdity only on the tacit assumption that we own the world." Now, with specific reference to the war in Iraq, Chomsky lifts up for consideration a discussion which was held at the time in Washington, focused not on the rightness, the justice, or the legality of the invasion, but simply on the most promising method for success, especially the method for stopping what they called the flow of foreign fighters across borders, where the term foreign fighters excluded Western troops. Now, the tacit premise underlying this debate and virtually all public discussions about Iraq or the Middle East, Noam Chomsky asserts, is, quote, that we own the world. Do we not have a right to invade? Do we not have a right to destroy a foreign country? Of course we do. That is a given. The only question is, will it work? Now, by contrast to Goethe's lines, the ownership referred to by Chomsky is predicated not on generosity, not on a largesse, but on privilege and domination. In our time, the privilege enjoyed by the owners of the world extends from the geopolitical and military to the technological and economic financial domains. In the latter domain, the economic financial domain, as we know, the privilege manifests itself in the gulf between the haves and the have-nots, the opulent, the rich, from the poor and destitute, the 1% and the 99%. Now, a major contributing factor to this widening gulf has been, as we know, neoliberalism, with its corollaries of financial deregulation and outsourcing of costs. As Noam Chomsky comments, referring to the economic meltdown of 2008 and 2009, quote, two major elements were, first of all, financialization, that means the shift of investor preference from industrial production to so-called FIRE, that means finance, insurance, and real estate, and the of production. Now, the resulting concentration of wealth, he adds, yielded greater political power for the rich, accelerating a vicious cycle that has led to extraordinary wealth for a fraction of 1% of the population, while the large majority of real incomes have virtually stagnated. In the geopolitical domain, the interests of the owner states, the owners of the world, are backed up by massive military power, an immense arsenal of weapons, including nuclear weapons, a far-flung network of military bases and installations. In the pursuit of these interests, owner states do not hesitate to launch unilateral wars of aggression and even preemptive wars in clear violation of the Charter of the United Nations, to which they are signatories. One example of such aggressive warfare was the attack on Iraq, which was a disaster for the Iraqi people by conservative estimates. At least between 300 to 500,000 civilians were killed by the attack, by the invasion of Iraq. Now, again, here we find the tacit assumption that Noam Chomsky uses the term, the tacit assumption, namely that we own the world. So what does it matter? What others think, what happens to others? The others are, he says, unpeople or non-people, to borrow the term used by a British diplomatic historian, Mark Curtis. The American philosopher Judith Butler recently has used the term the ungrievable people, the people who are not grieved. There's a distinction between people who are grieved, who come back from combat in coffins draped in national flags, and there are the other people who are ungrieved and ungrievable. Now, as is well known, the Iraq War was not the only facet of a much larger geopolitical strategy which is still unfolding. The Washington Post correspondent Robin Wright has introduced the notion of Cold War II, a notion which is picked up by Chomsky. One aspect of this new Cold War, or Cold War II, is the ratcheting up of military expenditure, with the leading owner states spending as much or more on military armaments as the rest of the world combined. One favorite phrase used by hegemonic leaders is, and you know it all, the favorite phrase, all options are on the table. All options are on the table. Whereas these options include not only defensive strategies, but also aggressive, preemptive forms of warfare. Now, all actions are on the table is a hideous phrase, is a savage phrase. We should reject it. It will mean as if there is no international law. If all options are on the table, there is no international law. There is no United Nations. There are no rules of the game. We can do as we please. All options are on the table was the phrase of Hitler when he invaded Czechoslovakia and Poland and Holland and France. This is when all options are on the table. Do we want to go this way? No. We have to oppose this phrase, all options are on the table. They are not on the table. On the table, there are rules of the game. In the case of other military technologies, the defensive rhetoric is entirely dropped in favor of near-random violence. A prime example of such mayhem is the remote control warfare by means of drones, which results in the near indiscriminate killing of militants and civilians alike, and which rightly has been denounced recently by a famous international lawyer, a war crimes lawyer, as a war crime. And I fully endorse it. I cannot speak for the World Public Forum on this. But for me, the use of drones is a war crime because you kill indiscriminately combatants and non-combatants. So that's so much for that. Now, as everyone knows, a major... Now, as everyone knows, a major catalyst for a possible transition from the Cold War II to a hot war today is the conflict over Iran, and especially its so-called nuclear aspirations. We have not spent enough time on this forum on the issue of Iran, and I apologize to our Iranian friends and Iranian visitors. On this issue, as Chomsky says, the drumbeats of war are reaching deafening proportions, with the constant invocations of a red line and all options on the table. Yet there is a perfectly sane and reasonable option on the table. There is an option on the table, namely the establishment of a nuclear-free zone in that area. As Chomsky writes in an essay called Containing Iran, Iran, he says, scarcely poses a military threat to the West, and any potential threat might be overcome if America would accept the view of the great majority of its own citizens and of Iranians and others, and permit the Middle East to become a nuclear-free zone, including Iran and Israel and US forces deployed there, a nuclear weapons-free zone. And at one point, the World Public Forum has actually endorsed, and you find it on our website, that we have endorsed the idea of a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Now, to be sure, in the policy of the so-called owners of the world, Iraq and Iran are only some stepping stones. Much larger targets in the future will be Russia and China. And we also have not perhaps spent enough time on this kind of issue. Seen as a whole, Chomsky's book is a wake-up call, if you will. It presents a grim picture of a world in the ownership of some people, the possessive grip of military, financial, and technological privilege. But he also mentions antidotes, possible antidotes. One major antidote he mentions is the cultivation of genuine democracy. Now, not spurious democracy, not militarized democracy, not imposed democracy, not interventionist democracy, but genuine democracy based on the insight that a functional democracy, he says at home, holds promise for a simple recognition. Democracy holds promise for that simple recognition, namely, that we do not own the world, we share it. That is the idea of democracy. Nobody owns democracy. We share democracy. This is why we have a democracy. Now, Chomsky in that context pleads for what he calls a large, active, popular base, which could become a major force in global civil society and global politics. But he also recognizes that organizing and educating such a base cannot mean just telling people what to do. It also means listening, experiencing, dialoguing with them about issues. Only if this is kept in mind can we, Chomsky says, set society on a more humane course. Now this, of course, is precisely the course that we are trying to pursue. This is precisely the premise, not the tacit assumption, but the explicit assumption of our World Public Forum, namely that we strive for justice through dialogue of civilizations and peoples of all races and colors and religions. So let us, at this end of this 10th session, rededicate ourselves to this goal and hope that at the end of the next 10 years, the world will be a more just, a more peaceful place for all of us and for our children and grandchildren to live in. Thank you very much.